back to the Way Everlasting YouTube channel. For several weeks now, we've been on the hunt to find out who Israel is in the scripture. And thank you for joining me again this week. I look forward to deep diving into the scripture with you. And just jumping right in. So up to this point, what we have really learned about the identity of Israel is that Yahweh covenanted with a people and identifies those people through his covenant of Shabbat. Shabbat was always the way we acknowledged and worshipped Yahweh as the creator. His people acknowledged and worshiped Yahweh as the creator. We learned previously that Ephraim and Manasseh most closely matched the blessing of Abraham passed down to Isaac, then passed down to Jacob, and ultimately to Joseph and his sons. We also learned that 7 nations or 7 regions made up the United States population to form the original 13 colonies of the Americas. Among those were certainly Great Britain and others that we really want to kind of key in on and try to understand, the scattering of Israel and what happened after the scattering of Israel. So we really want to look at and need to look at how through scripture and history that the lost tribes of Israel became scattered, because that's really the better word that the scripture is using to define the exile. So we spent a lot of time talking about the northern and southern kingdoms, both being conquered and exiled by either Babylon or Assyria. We also talked about a lot about how when Israel was scattered, there was the assimilation, or well, that's probably the right word. Mostly assimilation of the Babylonian customs of others, including Rome, and then through that you had the worldwide spreading of Sunday Sabbath by the Roman Catholic and Christianized Church. And because of this, it's not easy to identify Israel anymore being the people that keep the Shabbat, that worship on and guard it, either believer or Jew. And then that's also led to this theory that only the Jews in Israel, the tiny country of Israel, the 10 million Jews that are there, or people that are there that represent Israel, that somehow because they keep the Sabbath, that they're the only Israel that remains. So I really want to look at that a little bit closer to see, because we have the blessing of Abraham that many don't talk about, that was passed to Isaac and Jacob, and then Joseph and his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we've brought up, the chart where we show how it goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then you have the true 12 tribes of Israel that's made up of that lineage at that point. So I'll probably try to put that on the screen to just show that again. We shared how in the Teachings of the Way series, how Egyptian and Roman leaders marveled that Israelites would take a day off, aka the Shabbat, for rest, as this type of behavior was only reserved for the elite of society, mostly the political class. So let's look at some of the scripture verses about Israel being scattered and see if we can determine through scripture where they may have ended up. So in Ezekiel 34, verses 5 and 6, we come to the prophecies of Ezekiel. These lead into the prophecies of Daniel. And prior before that, we have some prophecies of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, the prophet, talking about the Medes and the Persians and the Babylonians. We've talked about some of those prophecies in Daniel and some others. So we're going to deep dive more into it in this Ezekiel 34, verse 5 and 6. And here we start to see the word scattered really used. It says that they were scattered, Israel was scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food to all the animals of the field, and were scattered. Now, in the original language, it's not animals, it's beasts. And remember, beasts represent kingdoms. So when it says they became food to all the kingdoms of the field and were scattered, if we look at in the original context, we're saying they became food to all the beasts of the field um, across the earth. Um, it's also a connotation to go back to um, the beginning where Adam and Eve are told to be fruitful and multiply, have dominion. They're talking about dominion over the kingdoms that were ultimately going to crop up, right? Even some of Shem's sons and others, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but he goes on to say, he says, "My sheep wandered through all the mountains and on every high hill. Yes, my sheep were scattered in all the surface of the earth, and there was none who searched or sought for them." Meaning they were taken into captivity, but there because the kings went with them, the political class, the prophets, everybody went into exile as a result of judgment. There's no one other than Yahweh who was looking upon and had truly orchestrated the events because of judgment. Um, that no one has really looked for the children of Israel at that point. But these are clues to tell us who took away the children of Israel. Well, we know that, but to follow that path of exile so that we could determine where Israel ended up. And we've already talked about how Israel could be represented by Great Britain and the United States. So there has to be a way to connect, number one, Great Britain to the exile of Israel. And we need to look for that and see if we can determine that through scripture and through historical context. So we continue the studies, go down to verse 12 of Ezekiel 34. We can look at 12 and 13. "As a shepherd seeks out his flock in the day that he is among his sheep that are scattered abroad, so will I seek out my sheep. I will deliver them out of all places where they have been scattered in the cloudy and dark day. I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries." Now, let me finish it and then I'll come back. "I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries and will bring them into their own land. I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, by the watercourses and in all the inhabited places of the country." Whenever this is talking about I will bring them out, I will bring them out of or from the peoples, is talking about the Gentiles. And I'll show you where these verses are as we go to them. But what we see in further down Ezekiel 34, verse 17, "As for you, O my flock, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I've judged between sheep and sheep, the rams and the male goats." Now, where have we heard the ram and the he goat, or the rams and the goats in Scripture? And those are found in Daniel's prophecy. And when it says between the sheep and the sheep, clearly it's talking about the divided kingdom of Israel, the northern and southern kingdom. So it's important to understand that at this point, Daniel, the prophet, is in Babylon. He's about to be overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. So when we see this in verse in Ezekiel 34 about the rams and the goats, or the ram and the he goat, we have reference to what is about to happen from Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 8. So if we go back and we look at that, Daniel chapter 8, verse 20 through 22. "The ram which you saw that had two horns, they are the kings of the Medes and the Persians. 21. The rough male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, most likely Alexander the Great. As for that which was broken, in the place whereof four stood up, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power. Kind of hard to follow, but effectively, the Israelites are among the nations, or if the Israelites are among the nations of the United Kingdom and ultimately came to the U.S., what evidence of this do we have in Scripture? Because Daniel 8 was talking about how very quickly um, the ram represented by uh, Medo Persia and the goat represented by Greece would be overtaking the kingdom of Babylon. So if we keep going, Ezekiel 36, verse 19, Ezekiel 30, chapter 36, verse 19, it says, Yahweh, I scattered them among the nations. Now, this is not the right word. In the original context, it would be Gentiles. And they were dispersed through the lands, according to their way, according to their doings, I judged them. So when they came to the Gentiles where they went, they profaned my Kodesh name. That means my dedicated name. And that men said of them, the Gentiles said of them, these are the people of Yahweh, and they are gone forth out of his land. So they were dumbfounded by it. Now, what this meant was the father was upset because his name was being truly profaned and that it was being forgotten. It was also impugning character upon Yahweh that he didn't and wasn't taking care of his people, his flock. And he wasn't happy about that. So if we continue to reading down 24 through 24 and verse 28, for I will take you from among the Gentiles and gather you out of all the countries and bring you into your own land. Now, we saw a subset of this with Israel, the land of Israel, in 1948, and where Israel becomes a nation again, basically overnight. And then, but that's not all Israel. So I will take you from among the Gentiles and gather you out of all the countries and will bring you into your own land. So again, we're trying to align that verse with the blessing of Jacob upon Israel that was placed upon Manasseh and Ephraim. If we look at verse 28, it says, you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your Elohim. Question is that land that he gave to his fathers just the land of Canaan, or do we have some other clues that we've shared with you already about the land of the north that also belonged to the father, possibly alluding to Northern Europe? And we'll talk about that as we kind of look at the migration paths. Now, in the book of 1 Kings chapter 12, we find a story of when Israel split into two kingdoms. It occurs at a time when David's son Solomon, his rule comes to an end and his son Rehoboam becomes king. Now, the people of Israel at the time are heavily taxed and they decide to send a delegation, which really was an ultimatum, to reduce their tax burden to Rehoboam, ensure that if he reduces their tax burden, they will serve him as king. But if not, they would reject him as king. And this is because Solomon's tax burden upon them before his death was so great that they didn't want to serve another king that would increase or carry that same tax burden. So they effectively gave an ultimatum. At this point, the people of Israel reject the king I'm sorry, Rehoboam consults with his counselors, uh, and in the end, he takes bad counsel um, from his group of counselors that grew up with him, effectively, instead of the more seasoned counselors that served Solomon, King Solomon, and the house of David. Um, he takes the younger counselors' counsel and decides to increase the burden of taxes, and that splits the kingdom between two kings away from the house of David. It's at this point that some of the people of Israel, they reject the king from the royal house of David, instead name as their king Jeroboam. Now, this is really important to understand because Jeroboam Jeroboam is the reason for judgment that we've been talking about, the exile of Yehuda and the exile of the kingdom of uh, Israel, the northern kingdom. The reason for that is because of Jeroboam. Because if you study this out, when the father leads his people out of the Exodus from Egypt into the wilderness, they make the calf. He he executes some judgment on them, but not full judgment. And the effect that you see, like with the exile, he does judge certain members that participate in these events. So I'm not saying that, but what you see is they come out and they sin. They create a golden calf or an idol, is what we understand it, and they're asked to worship it. While of course Moses is on the mountain, getting the first, getting all the loving instruction of the Father, the Ten Commandments, and we have the whole playing out of Israel going into land of Canaan, establishing their kingdoms, and then um, going through the reign of David, the reign of Solomon. Solomon then, at the end of his life, starts to turn from Yahweh's word, stops guarding Yahweh's way, allows sin to come in, and sin in this case is the wickedness of following his own path and not the path of Yahweh. That in effect sows the seed for his sons, um, his lineage to start this downward spiral of judgment, which the father had already predetermined, if you want to say it that way, that they were going to be judged because of the sins of Egypt, and the sins that they performed after Egypt. And there's other examples of this where he stays his judgment. He doesn't execute judgment on Israel several times, not just the golden calf. There's other instances, but now you have Rehoboam becoming king over part of Israel, and he starts to institute some of the same worship practices that we saw under the exodus of Egypt in the wilderness. And the father has had enough. So, um, at this time, the people of Israel, they basically choose Jeroboam as their king, but they also choose a new capital that's north of Jerusalem in Samaria. So Samaria, if you study the scripture when Yeshua is teaching and on the earth, he goes to the Samaritans, and he talks about them. They talk about how the difference between the two. Basically, Israel, what was left of Israel, was split, right, and said, "Hey, we worship on this mountain. You say you worship on that mountain." That's the conversation that Yeshua was having about Samaria. It's because of the sin of Jeroboam, that led to them setting up a new capital north of Jerusalem in Samaria. Now, the southern kingdom consisted of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and later some of Levi, who would return when the northern kingdom's leader Jeroboam replaced the Levite priest to retain his control of his subjects. And that's the next thing he did was We're going to talk about more of this, but he replaced the Levitical, the Lewi priesthood from Acharon, the sons of Zadok. Jeroboam came to power and was worried that when his people traveled to Jerusalem for the annual feast days, that they would see their old king and kingdom and return to the house of David and kill him. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 12, 26 through 27. I'm sharing it just for reference so you guys can look at it. So he took action. And later the scripture says this is what he determined in his heart, basically, is he took action to protect his position, his kingdom, by devising his own religious system. He made 2 idols, setting them up in the towns of Dan and Bethel, which he made the centers of worship. He hired the lowest of the people to be his priests, created a counterfeit feast of the tabernacles for the people to observe in the 8th month, not the 7th, as Yahweh had ordained in Leviticus 23 through 34. We can see in 1 Kings chapter 12, 28 through 33, kind of how this went down. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, so idols of gold. He said to them, now listen to what he says. He says, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem to see your Elohim, Israel, the Elohim which brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim. See how he's playing on their past belief, even the statements that Moses made about this. What he's doing is he's establishing his seat of authority, because up to this point, Moses' seat of authority is the Torah. So now what he's doing, he's establishing his seat of authority by quoting some of the phrases from Moses coming out of Egypt. He said one of the idols in Bethel, Beit El, and the other he put in Dan. This thing became a sin. This is like an emphasized statement that the scripture is sharing with us. Remember, sin is not missing the mark. Sin is doing your own thing. And we'll see why he was doing his own thing. For the people went to worship before the one in Bethel, and even went as far as Dan, which is a further journey to worship it. Now, he made houses of high places. He made the priests, the Kohanim, from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi, And then Jeroboam or Yerovam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month. It was like the feast that is in Yehuda, in the southern kingdom. And he went up to the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificed to the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the Kohanim, the priests, the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel, and on the 15th day in the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. So, which he had devised in his own heart, just doing your own thing. He ordained a feast for the children of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. This event truly led to the downfall of Israel, specifically the Father declaring judgment. It paved the way also, though, for Sunday worship. Remember, the scripture says there's nothing new under the sun. It's not it's not being funny when it says that. It's what it's saying is, we've talked about how Catholicism, or the Catholic Church under Constantine, the Roman Catholic Institute, that system changed Saturday Shabbat, or the seventh day Shabbat, to the first day Sunday worship. But even before that, Jeroboam actually started this whole process, so that when later it's introduced, it's just a natural thing for them to just turn. Second Kings. So this event, though, we're going to talk more about it. With he's basically changing the Feast of Tabernacles, the day that in the month that starts on, and he's getting them to adopt another day to go, so that they don't have to go to Israel, to Jerusalem specifically, to worship in that month, and then at every year, because he was worried about them seeing the old ways and turning back. And naturally, it worked. I mean, we see it in to this day that there's still Samaritans, Samaria, and there's um, Israelites that are split in this view. 2 Kings 17:16 says that they forsook all the commands. They forsook all of Yahweh's loving instruction of Yahweh their Elohim, and made molten images of 2 calves. They also made an Asherah, um, and worshipped all the host of the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars. But more importantly, they served Baal. And I've showed you how in the teachings of the way, this is very easily correlated to the Hebrew word for Lord, the one you have been tricked into saying, whenever in reality you're really saying Baal, you're not saying Lord. So we see in Hosea, even 200 years later, that Israel turned to Baal worship. So this really stuck in the kingdom. And remember, I told you, this led to the high places being set up, and the Father saying very specifically, when I take you into exile, I will personally burn these high places to the ground. You know, he was very upset about the Baal worship. So we know 200 years later in the book of Hosea, when that's being written, Baal worship is still occurring. We also see that that's when the nation of Israel begins to observe the first day of the week as Shabbat, not the seventh day, and they stop guarding Yahweh's seventh day Shabbat. They acknowledged the golden idols as their creator, not Yahweh as the creator, by guarding and following Shabbat, same as Christians and Messianic Jews continue this practice in modern churches. They do this on Baal's day, that is Sun Day. It was called the Day of the Lord, the Day of Baal. They just tricked you. It's not Yahweh's day, Shabbat. Okay? And I share those verses so you can look at it in a little bit more detail. But Hosea 2:11, so you can see it with your own eyes. I will also cause all her celebrations, her feasts, her moeds, her new moons, her Shabbaoth, that's the Sabbaths, all her solemn assemblies to end. Okay? So is it really any wonder that the same idols used after the Exodus from Egypt appear again under Jeroboam? After all, Egypt is the home of the city of Heliopolis, known as the city of the sun, or more appropriately, the city of Helios, the sun god, who the Greeks and after them the Romans all adopted. Nothing new under the sun. Jeroboam replaced the tribe of Lewi in the Levitical priesthood, who were the most educated and knowledgeable of the written Torah, with the lowest and most ignorant of the people, so that he could control the belief. And it remains that way to this day with the modern day Rabbi who follow their oral tradition. They deny the seat of Moses' authority, the Torah, and they do not follow the written Torah, but instead the traditions of men. And they've spoon-fed them to the people, and many have bought into those lies. Additionally, we see that Jeroboam set up two great idols for the people to worship, even went as far as to change the fall festival to be observed in the 8th month at a place of his choosing, north of Palestine or Israel, instead of in the 7th month at Jerusalem as Yahweh instructed. But his worst evil decree as king was to move the Sabbath day from the 7th to the 8th day of the week, we now call Sunday, not Shabbat. This is important because we see the number 8 used in Scripture to represent a change or a new beginning. So, like with Yahweh using Noah's 8 family members to start a new beginning whenever the flood occurs. But in the case of Jeroboam, to be used to bring a change to Yahweh's Shabbat, to usher in a new beginning of pagan worship of sun day for Israel, resulting in Israel's judgment. Now, the northern kingdom consisted of the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, along with Ephraim and Manasseh, and then soon to become the lost 10 tribes. We see through Scripture a rule of 19 kings, 7 dynasties, where the 10-tribed house of Israel continued in the sins of Jeroboam, king after king after king, dynasty after dynasty after dynasty, their idolatry, and no longer guarding Yahweh's Shabbat. And again, Exodus 31:16, therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Shabbat, to observe the Shabbat throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. Ezekiel 20, verse 12, moreover, also I gave them my Shabbaoth, my Shabbats, my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am Yahweh who kadoshes them. This really brings us full circle back to our study at this point, where as a result of this wickedness of Israel following their own way, and really search your heart, because if you're a believer, whether you call yourself a Christian, a Messianic Jew, a Catholic, whatever, Protestant, Baptist, it doesn't matter. Search your heart. If you want to follow Scripture, why aren't you following Exodus 31, Ezekiel 20? The Shabbats are a covenant for eternity. Not just the Shabbat day, but the Sabbaths, that proceed certain feast days, Moed days, dedicated days for Yahweh on his prophetic timeline. So truly search your heart, that the Father could speak to you and show you that this is by celebrating Shabbat, you're acknowledging him as the creator. That's the sin of Jeroboam, as he was acknowledging those idols that cannot speak, move, pray for, or touch them. They're not physical. They don't have physical attributes. He was trying to attribute creation to them, which are inanimate objects. And this does bring us full circle back to our study at this point, where as a result of wickedness of Israel following their own way, Yahweh causes the house of Israel to be invaded, conquered, and not cut off, but conquered and brought into captivity as slaves to the kingdom of Assyria. So I've shared some maps to try to show you kind of what the kingdom of Assyria would look like. And I'll point out some key areas on these maps. Most don't understand that the kingdom of Assyria, or I think when people think about the kingdom of Assyria, they think about Muslims or Arabs. And it really is not, it could be the furthest thing from the truth. Most don't understand that the kingdom of Assyria, soon after this invasion, they had established their kingdom. But they had to leave their land and migrate northwest through the lands that are now Georgia and Poland to the land ultimately now, what is called Germany today. So I'm showing you just here the Assyrian Empire from 671 to 824 BC, so you can see what the thing that I want to point out is where you see the Black Sea at the top of this map. What you got to understand is where you see Cimmerians with a C, Kingdom of Urartu, and then the Phrygian Kingdom. This is Turkey. This is modern day Turkey. And then you have the landmass that's connecting the at the southern side of the Black Sea into Eastern Europe. Now, if Israel was with the Assyrians at the exile, we know the Assyrians migrated northwest. Okay, and they migrated northwest into Eastern Europe. So I'm showing in another map where you can see that migration path. Now, again, the Black Sea here in the center above Galatia. So when the scripture talks about the Galatians, that's modern day Turkey. That was at the time of the scripture of the New Testament, the original, the renewed covenant, where Paul and Shaul and all them are there. That's Galatia. That's former Roman territory. And you have the Assyrians who attack Rome from the north, and I'll show you that on another map. But what I want you to pay attention to is that you have the Parthians, you have the Assyrians migrating into Parthia region and then migrating around the Black Sea into Eastern Europe. So what that map is going to show is that there's a common view that of the migration of the lost 10 tribes of Israel from Assyria, that view would show that Israel migrated through what is now Europe, Great Britain, and North Africa. Now, I love this position because it fits most every viewpoint, if you will, of who and where Israel came from. So it doesn't matter if you said that the Black Hebrews from Africa, the Native American or the Native Indians of America, or the Europeans that migrated to the Americas, or the Irish, the Vikings, all those who came to Northern America, they all ended in North America. That's the bottom line. And history is even being, I think, rewritten today with some of the events that are surrounding this, to show that North America was populated way before Columbus. So now this major migration, you got to understand, it took around 1,200 years. I'm talking about the Assyrians into Eastern Europe, and then finally landing in Germany. It started in 721 BCE. It covered the Middle East, all of Europe, and North Africa. Now, don't get hung up on the dates or the times or anything like that. We're trying to give you I'm trying to give you an idea of the size of scale. 1,200 years is a long time to do this migration. So you have to understand the Assyrians had the children of Israel in exile. Some of them migrated with the Assyrians. Some of them were left in lands to suffer unspeakable atrocities. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm just trying to establish for you, the migration took around 1,200 years. So if we said starting in 721 BCE, the tribes of Israel moved northeast through Assyria to Parthia. That's what I was showing you, where they settled for some 900 years. Around 200 CE, the major movement occurred northwest across Europe to what is now the northern parts of the Netherlands and Germany. Tribes moved into Europe for the next 2 to 3 centuries following that. Between 400 and 500 CE, the migration moved north into Scandinavia, migrated to the west into Britain with its Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, and then to the southeast into what is now Italy, and southwest through Iberia. Some settled in what is now Portugal and into what is now Spain, displacing the Vandals who moved into North Africa to a revolt there. Now, all these countries, I will show you, once they get established in a foothold, they get attacked by these groups. And when I say these groups, I mean either the Assyrians themselves or types of groups that represent the Assyrian. And I'll show you why. So you have the Spanish with the Inquisitions, but let me just try to break down a little bit further. So no one will really debate that the Assyrians were a cruel and warlike people who were used by Elohim to punish his people. But the scripture also says he used them to punish the surrounding nations who practice idolatry as well. What we should take note of is that the Assyrians were especially cruel in the tactics and methods of conquest. We know from history that most Assyrian kings had a policy to transport the people from the defeated kingdoms and other territories. They would enslave them and kill them in great numbers. They would torture them as a means of entertainment. They praised false mighty ones themselves, and then they shed much innocent blood. They would do this to break the will of their enemies to resist, and rarely married outside their race. Does this sound familiar to the Nazis of Germany? And now think about the Aryan doctrine of Germany in each of the world wars that they started. Do you think it's a coincidence the familiarity of the name Assyrian and the term Aryan, considering how Germany enslaved the Jews and committed horrible acts against them in concentration camps? They would often set up these camps in regions that were unknown to the Allies. They were not in the German main fronts of territory. It's not a stretch to see this kingdom, the Assyrians, have survived to present day. The Germans survived to the present day and match the Assyrians of Scripture. Now, so you don't just take my word for it. Germany attracts tourists today to the city of Trier. According to actual German historians, Trier is Germany's oldest city. Trier is believed by the local Germans was founded by the Assyrians in 2000 BCE or BC. According to local German historians, Trier was founded by Tabitha, a son of the famous Assyrian king Ninus. In fact, they believe that Trier existed for 1300 years before Rome was rebuilt. So according to Greek historians, the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh in scripture was built by Ninus, and where the name Nineveh is derived. When we compare scripture in Genesis 10, chapter 8 through 12, we can also look in Jubilees 9, verse 3. We know that the builder of Nineveh was Asher. This is the second son of Shem under Nimrod. Asher, Assher, is a Greek name for Asshur, Asshur. But the original Ninus was grandson of Ham of the black race. Asher, son of Shem, was white. Also took the name Ninus. Now, this is not a controversial statement. Okay, the point we're making is the Assyrians were white. Um, Ninus was grandson of Ham of the black race. Asher, son of Shin, who was white, also took the name Ninus. Now, Cush means black in Hebrew, and this is we know that uh, 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 everyone should know this, that Yahweh formed all men from the dust of the earth. There are 7 colors or formations of that earth that make up the earth's dust. So when we say white or black or red, we're talking about the actual colors of the earth that the Father gave us. It is believed this is Ninus II, who founded Nineveh, that prophets in the scripture dreaded to visit for fear of being put to death. Further, it is recorded in the most ancient German records, including the official history of Bavaria, that some of Asher's descendants settled in Europe from Mesopotamia soon after the flood. However, the great majority of the German people did not migrate until a much later time. Then the Assyrian Empire collapsed in the 7th century BC. Now, why did we say white in color? This is not a racist comment, but a simple fact that the 1st century Greek geographer Strabo called the Assyrians the white Syrians. So we have a historian of the Greeks calling the Assyrians with his own eyes the white Syrians, and noted their fair complexion, making them stand out from other people in the Middle East. Seems pretty straightforward to me. We also know from history that the Central Asian warriors invaded Assyria and forced them to settle the southern shores of the Black Sea. That's why I pointed out the Black Sea for you in the map. From the writings of the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, he wrote, quote, "Many of the conquered peoples were removed to other homes, and 2 of these became very great colonies. The one was composed of Assyrians and was removed to the land between Patagonia and Pontus on the southern border of the Black Sea. Further to this, another Greek historian named Herodotus confirmed the existence of Assyrian occupants, stating the Cappadocians, the people of the land between Patagonia and Pontus, are known to the Greeks by the name Syrians. Syrians, not Assyrians, but Syrians. And this is an important point because through history, you're going to see the name of the Assyrians change. This people, whom the Greeks call Syrians, are called Assyrians by the barbarians, the Huns and the Mongols that were in the same region just further north. At this point, the Assyrians had become so populous in this area of the Black Sea, the Greeks called the region Assyria. So clearly, the Assyrians and the Assyrian Empire had established a presence around the Black Sea. We even have record where in 480 BC, Herodotus records the Assyrians fighting for the Persian king Xerxes against the Greeks. It's shortly after this war campaign fails that we see a great migration of the Assyrian people occurring to the seas to the northern shores called Scythia, another name that they will adopt. Scythia was known to be the land beyond the civilized world by the Greeks and filled with nomadic mounted elite warrior tribes of 2 racial types, the Caucasoids from the Caucasus Mountains and the Mongoloids. It's here in Roman historical record we see Assyrians now called Scythians. People first began invading Central and Western Europe in late 2nd century BC, soon after their northern move, and migrated all the way into what is now German territories. In addition to this, in Roman record, we see the Assyrians become known as the Sarmatians. And on those maps, you'll see Sarmatia to the north of the Black Sea as well, as they, over a period of hundreds of years, migrate to modern day Germany, displacing the elite warriors, but keeping their culture as it spread westward to southern Russia and Ukraine, and finally into Germany. From here, the Assyrian tribes begin to pressure Rome on their migration, and as different Scythian people became known through warfare and trade, the Greeks and Romans gave them new names. When Roman generals called the fierce tribes they battled Germany, that's Germani, not Y, which meant war man or warrior, and they have lived up to this reputation. So we see that the Assyrians just took on the names of the regions that they migrated through as they conquered lands and people alike in their fierce war machine. First the Assyrians, the Scythians, the Alans, and then finally the Germans. The Germany warmen are warriors, and ultimately Germans. Now I'm showing on the map so you can see a map of the Roman Empire, but you can also see the Assyrian attack on the northern side of the Roman territories. And this is important because we have an account from Jerome, the writer who gave us the Latin Vulgate. So if you're looking for like if historians aren't enough for you, here is Jerome, who helped write the Latin Vulgate, those scriptures in the original Latin Vulgate, copies of the original Hebrew. So he was a writer of the Latin Vulgate translation of scripture. He was an eyewitness to the invasions, saying, savage tribes in countless numbers have overrun all parts of Gaul, Rome. The whole country between the Alps, Pyrenees, between the Rhine and the ocean has been laid waste by hordes of. Now he calls them the Quadi, the Vandals, Sarmatians, the Alans, the Gepids, Huruls, Saxons, Burgundians, Alemanni, and even Pannonians. And Ashur also is joined with them. Ashur, Asshur, is just another name for Ashur, Assyria, Asshur. In the end, the Germans and Assyrians share the same physical features. They are white, the same savage warlike tendencies, and even certain characteristics in art. So why did I go through all this in our study? Because through the migration of Assyria, of the Assyrians who led Israel into captivity, through their migration into Eastern Europe and then beyond into Finland and other areas, but basically through modern day Europe, the people of Israel who were in captivity to the Assyrians, we're talking about 1200-year migration. They didn't remain slaves in captivity for that whole time. You got to understand that the sheer number of Israelites that were led into captivity and the distance traveled in the migration over that 1200-year span, there's no way that they remained in captivity. Okay? So we will look at how the tribes of, next week we're going to look at how the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh specifically settled in the British Isles. Now, we get our first clue because they call themselves British. British is a Hebrew word. It means barit, meaning covenant, and ish, meaning man. It basically means covenant man or covenant man with Elohim. And that's exactly what they are. And we're going to show that. Now, some teach that Israel lost its language in exile, that they adopted the Assyrian language. I'm not convinced of this given the name of the British. It's an actual Hebrew word. So certainly they still had some semblance of their language through this migration effort, and they still maintain it. Now, certainly over time, Hebrew has become more and more distorted, and I talk about this in the teachings of the way. I give you very clear examples of this. Um, First with Aramaic, that was the first distortion, and now mixing the Paleo and the modern Hebrew, so that basically it no longer resembles the original Paleo, which would be the father's original 22 letter pictures. So when we come back together, we're going to deep dive into Ephraim and Manasseh. Look at some of the symbolisms from Jacob, and how they ended up describing in many different ways the people of Britain or the British. Can't wait to connect with you.